Hey there. Tonight, we step back, not into grand castles or bustling cities, but into the hidden heart of medieval life. A world where history wasn't written in gold leaf or etched into stone, but carried in the hands of those who tilled the soil, mended the roofs, and weathered the storms. We're talking about the peasants, the forgotten backbone of a kingdom. They didn't wear crowns or lead armies, but they endured. Through famine, through war, through seasons that stretched on endlessly. They built their lives with what little they had, and somehow, they made it enough. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, calming hum. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far our stories reach across the world. Now, close your eyes if you like, and imagine a quiet village, hidden deep in the folds of time. No name, no place on a map, just a collection of thatched roofs leaning against the wind. A place where life is measured not in years, but in harvests. A place where survival is its own kind of rebellion. Let's begin. The sun crept lazily over the distant hills, casting long shadows across the patchwork fields that spread like a worn quilt over the landscape. The village, unnamed and unmarked on any map, rested in a shallow valley, tucked away from the ambitions of kings and the gaze of lords. Its existence was as unremarkable as the dirt paths that wound through it, paths beaten down by bare feet and wooden carts, paths that led nowhere and everywhere within the confines of this forgotten stretch of land. There were maybe 15 families here, though the number fluctuated with the seasons. Children were born, old men died, and sometimes a traveler might pass through, leaving behind rumors of distant cities with stone walls and bustling markets. But mostly, things stayed the same. Time moved differently here, not in years or even seasons, but in harvests. A good harvest meant survival, a bad one meant empty bellies and whispered prayers. The village elder, a stooped man named Bram, claimed to have seen 50 winters, though his back was bent and his hands gnarled as if he'd carried every one of those years on his shoulders. People listened when Bram spoke, not because he was wise, but because he was old, and age here was the closest thing to wisdom anyone could hope to achieve. The cottages were slumped and crooked, their roofs sagging under layers of thatch that had been patched more times than anyone could remember. Walls of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud and straw, leaned inward as if seeking warmth from one another. Smoke curled from holes cut in the roofs, drifting lazily into the morning air before dispersing into the gray sky. The smell of damp earth, livestock, and boiled turnips hung heavy over the village, clinging to clothes and skin like a second layer. The road that led into the village wasn't really a road at all, just a track worn down by years of trudging feet and stubborn oxen. It curved away toward the forest, thick with oaks and elms that huddled together like conspirators. To the villagers, the forest was both a lifeline and a boundary. It provided wood for the hearth, game for the stew pot, and herbs for healing. But it also whispered secrets when the wind blew just right, secrets of things best left undisturbed. Hunters never went too deep, and children were warned to stay within sight of the tree line. There were stories, of course, stories of things that moved between the trunks, shadows that lingered too long, voices that called out in the dead of night. But stories were only stories, until they weren't. Every morning began the same. Before dawn, the village creaked to life. Fires were stoked, pots were hung, and the thin cries of hungry children pierced the stillness. Women bent low over cauldrons, stirring pottage that bubbled thick and gray. It was the same every day: barley, beans, leeks if they were lucky, and sometimes a bit of salt pork, though that was rare enough to be a cause for celebration. The smell of it drifted through the open windows, mixing with the sharp tang of wood smoke. Outside, men hauled water from the well, its bucket creaking with each pull of the rope. The well had been there longer than anyone could remember, its stones worn smooth by hands that had long since turned to dust. Some said it was blessed, others said cursed, but no one ever explained why. It was simply the well, and it had always been there. Its water was brackish and cold, but it kept the village alive, so its taste was never questioned. As the sun climbed higher, the fields beckoned. Rows of barley and rye stretched out in uneven lines, broken only by patches of bare earth where the soil had refused to yield. Men and women worked side by side, their hands calloused from years of pulling weeds and turning the stubborn earth. There were no plows here, only wooden hoes and bent backs, and the work was slow and unforgiving. But it was theirs, their land, their sweat, their harvest, and the thin hope that this year might be better than the last. Beyond the fields, the forest loomed, dark and unyielding. Its edge was marked by a line of stones, half buried and covered in moss. No one knew who had placed them there, only that they had always been. Some of the older villagers still left offerings, bundles of herbs, a strip of cloth, a coin if they could spare it, just in case. The forest watched but never spoke. At midday, they would pause, gathering under the meager shade of a lone chestnut tree that stood stubbornly at the field's edge. Bread was broken, hard and stale, but dipped in stew it softened enough to chew. They spoke in low voices, exchanging news of sick animals and spoiled crops, of children who had grown another inch since last winter, of the sky that seemed a little grayer than the year before. Bram would sometimes join them, his stories trailing off into silence as if the words had been stolen from his lips. When the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, the village retreated to its homes. Doors were latched, shutters pulled tight, and fires were fed until they roared with life. Outside, the shadows grew long and deep, creeping up the walls of the cottages and stretching across the dirt paths like reaching fingers. And the village slept, wrapped in the silence of the valley, hidden from the world that had long since forgotten it existed. But there were whispers, soft ones, carried on the wind from the forest's edge. Whispers of change, of movement in the shadows, of eyes that watched from the tree-lean with something more than mere curiosity. The villagers spoke of it only in hushed tones, if at all, their eyes darting to the edge of the forest and back again. They had learned to ignore the whispers, just as they ignored the stories of shadows and spirits that crept between the trees. After all, stories were only stories. Until they weren't. The morning came not with a burst of light, but a slow crawl, the kind that seeped through the cracks in the shutters and stirred the straw on the floor. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving only a whisper of heat clinging to the stones. You rose when the light finally claimed the room, stretching joints that creaked like old wood, shaking off the stiffness of sleep on uneven ground. There was no alarm, no bell, just the instinctive knowledge that the day had begun, and so must you. Outside, the world stretched wide and indifferent, fields patched with frost, trees bent and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. You pushed open the door, letting the cold bite at your skin, a reminder that the fire would need tending soon. The village was already awake, moving with the quiet rhythm of necessity. A few women gathered at the well, their breath turning to fog as they hauled buckets from the depths, arms straining under the weight of water and expectation. Further down the path, the blacksmith's forge coughed smoke into the morning air, its fire a rare glow of warmth and purpose. You nodded to the neighbors you passed, gestures more habitual than friendly. A glance, a nod, sometimes a word if it was necessary. Community here was less about companionship and more about survival. You needed them, and they needed you, and that unspoken bond held everything in place like poorly stitched fabric, frayed, stretched, but holding. Today was like most days. You checked the fences, patching holes where the wood had gone soft, where the frost had bitten too deeply. The chickens clucked their discontent as you scattered feed, eyes beady and sharp, pecking at the earth with relentless efficiency. You watched them for a moment, envying their simplicity. They never seemed to worry if the winter would be harsh or if the grain would hold out. By midday, the sun hung low, casting long shadows that crept across the village paths like specters. You paused to wipe the sweat from your brow, the air crisp and thin, stinging your lungs with each breath. Lunch was not an event, merely a pause. A hunk of bread, hard and dense, broken by hand and shared with whatever company was near. Sometimes it was a neighbor, sometimes just the chickens, watching with unblinking eyes for crumbs. The field stretched out before you, lines of earth broken and waiting, a promise and a threat. Harvest was months away, and the seeds had yet to be sown. The soil clung to your boots as you walked its edges, inspecting, planning, hoping. The land was both lifeline and prison, demanding everything and giving only what it pleased. You had heard tales of greener fields, of richer soil in places far from here, but those were stories, half-dreamed whispers carried by merchants who passed through once or twice a year. The afternoon passed with its usual monotony, chores flowing into one another without ceremony. You mended what could be mended, patched what could be patched, and ignored what couldn't. The light began to fade, sinking behind the trees in a slow, reluctant retreat. You gathered what wood you could find, stacking it by the door, feeling the weight of the coming cold settle into your bones. Inside, the fire was stoked back to life, its flames licking at the edges of the pot that hung above it. Pottage again, thick, unchanging, familiar. You stirred it with the end of a wooden spoon, watching as bits of root and grain swirled in lazy circles. It wasn't good, but it was warm, and sometimes that was enough. Supper was silent. Words were sparse, reserved for necessity. A nod here, a gesture there. You ate with purpose, chewing slowly, feeling the food settle in your stomach like stone. There were no prayers, no grace, just the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the gaps in the walls, sending a shiver across the room. After the meal, the fire was banked, its flames reduced to glowing embers that pulsed in the dark like the heartbeat of the house. You lay down on the straw, pulling the rough blanket over your shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of it settle. The room grew quiet, breath slowing, settling into the rhythm of sleep. Outside, the village slept too, its paths empty, its fires dimmed. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath against the chill of the night. You closed your eyes, and the darkness took you, pulling you under with the slow, deliberate patience of time itself. And in that quiet, you dreamed not of castles or riches or far-off lands, but of mornings like this one, of fire and frost, of fields and fences, of bread and silence. Because here, that was everything. And for now, it was enough. The seasons in your village were less a measure of time and more a cycle of survival. Spring was when the earth awoke, shaking off the frost and cracking open under the weight of the plow. The elders always said you could smell it, the dampness of thawing mud, the tang of sprouting grass, and the faint trace of ash where last year's fields had been burned clean. Spring wasn't gentle. It clawed its way out of winter's grip with muddy hands, flooding paths, soaking fields, turning everything soft and heavy. The work began early, long before the sun fully broke the horizon. You pushed the wooden plow through the furrows, each step a negotiation with the earth. It fought you, clinging to the iron blade, resisting each turn. But you pushed on because the planting couldn't wait. Seeds were precious, more valuable than bread, sometimes more than life itself. You held them in your hands, tiny promises of what might come if the weather was kind and the earth willing. You pressed each one into the soil with a prayer, though you weren't quite sure who you were praying to. The priest spoke of God and the saints, but here, with your hands buried in the dirt, it was the land itself you bargained with. Summer stretched out long and lean, the sun hovering above the fields like a watchful eye. The work shifted from planting to tending, pulling weeds, checking fences, ensuring the crows stayed hungry and far from your crops. Sweat clung to your skin, your hands blistered and rough, but the fields began to show promise, green shoots pushing through brown earth, stretching toward the light with a stubbornness you admired. The village moved with the rhythm of the harvest. Mornings were filled with the sound of axes splitting wood, the shuffle of feet along dusty paths, the low hum of voices carrying across the fields. You worked beside neighbors, shoulders brushing, hands calloused and brown from the sun. There were no fences between you, no lines drawn in the dirt. What belonged to one belonged to all, for better or worse. Sometimes, the steward came through, sitting high on his horse, eyes sharp and calculating. He watched the fields, the way the grain bent under the wind, the number of livestock penned near the edge of the village. He carried a ledger, its pages thin and worn, marked with the debts and dues of every family in the village. He never spoke much, just nodded or pointed, and you answered with silence. There were no arguments. The steward didn't care for them, and the lash was never far from his saddle. There were moments, rare and fleeting, where the weight of it all seemed to lift. The evening after a long day's work, when the sun hung low and fat on the horizon, casting the fields in gold and shadow. The village would gather, nothing formal, just neighbors leaning on fence posts or sitting on rough-hewn benches, sharing what little news there was. Sometimes someone would bring out an old lute or a battered drum, and for a few short hours, the weight of living felt just a bit lighter. You listened to the old stories then, tales of heroes and saints, of kings who rode with iron fists and queens who wept for their fallen. The elders would pass around cups of thin ale, hands shaking with age but eyes sharp with memory. The fire would crackle, sending sparks up toward the stars, and for a little while, you almost forgot the dirt under your nails, the ache in your back, the debt hanging over your head like a shadow. But dawn always came, dragging with it the sharp pull of reality. The fields waited, the animals waited, and the steward's ledger never forgot. Harvest was not a celebration, it was survival. When the wheat finally bent under its own weight, heavy and ripe, you moved like clockwork. Sickles in hand, you cut row after row, binding the stalks in tight bundles, stacking them in neat piles along the edge of the path. The manor would take its share first. A cart would roll down the muddy track, steered by men in wool coats and hard eyes. You'd load the grain without question, stacking it high, knowing it would not feed your family. It was the price for living on the Lord's land, for borrowing his earth and his water, for sharing in his bounty. You didn't like it, but you accepted it. It was the way things had always been. What was left belonged to you, barely enough for the winter, sometimes less. You stored it carefully, sealing it away from damp and rot, knowing that each handful taken now was a risk come January. If the yield was good, there was a little comfort. If it was poor, there was none. Either way, you stretched it as far as it would go, counting each day against the size of the pile, hoping one would not outlast the other. When the last sheaf was bound and the fields lay bare, you took a moment to breathe, to wipe the dirt from your hands and feel the lightness of an empty field. The work was done, for now. Winter would bring its own burdens, but there would be time to rest before the snow came. You leaned on your sickle, eyes scanning the horizon, taking in the land that both held you and bound you. It was yours only in the way the wind was yours, to breathe in but never keep. But for now, it was enough. Winter came not with a whisper, but with a howl. The first frost crept across the fields like a thin veil, hardening the soil and stiffening the leaves that clung desperately to the last remnants of autumn. You felt it in your bones before you saw it on the ground, an ache that settled deep and refused to leave, a promise of long nights and lean days. The village braced itself. Roofs were patched with bundles of straw, mud was slapped thick against the wattle walls, and firewood was stacked high against every hut, more out of hope than certainty. There was always the chance it wouldn't be enough. You remembered winters when the woodpile dwindled too fast, when the fire had to be rationed, when you'd woken with ice on the blanket and breath that hung in the air like smoke. The animals came inside, crowding the cramped spaces. Chickens huddled in wicker baskets, their feathers fluffed up against the cold. The goats, always stubborn, bleated softly, stamping their hooves against the dirt floor, protesting the confinement. But there was no choice. Outside, the wolves grew bolder, their howls slipping through the cracks in the shutters at night. You took turns feeding the fire, one eye always on the flames, coaxing them to stay bright and alive. Wood was precious, more so than bread. The fire was the difference between waking up stiff and waking up not at all. In the deepest parts of winter, when the snow piled thick and the wind cut through even the strongest walls, you learned to sleep in shifts, feeding the fire and checking the roof for leaks. There were stories, old ones, told by the firelight to pass the time and keep the dark at bay. Tales of spirits wandering the woods, of wraiths that stalked the shadows, of children lost to the frost and never found. The elders spoke of creatures that lived beyond the trees, things with sharp teeth and long memories. You didn't know if the stories were true, but you never lingered outside after dark. No one did. The church bells rang less often in winter. The priest, Father Edwin, wrapped in layers of wool and a threadbare cloak, would trudge through the snow to lead Mass on Sundays. The stone chapel was always cold, its walls thick with frost, but it was tradition, and tradition was as close to comfort as you had. You sang hymns with chapped lips, your breath fogging in the air, your hands clasped together more for warmth than prayer. On feast days, the village gathered, bringing what little they had. A loaf of bread, a dried fish, maybe a flask of thin ale if the stores had been kind. Father Edwin would bless the food, his voice cracking with the chill, and you'd eat together, huddled around the fire pit in the center of the square. The flames leaped high, casting long shadows across tired faces. For a moment, the cold seemed distant, the hunger bearable. But the lean days always returned. You stretched what you had as far as it would go, roots dug up before the frost took them, cabbages preserved in salt, beans soaked and stewed until they lost all shape but not their weight. The stew pot never left the fire, simmering endlessly, growing thinner and thinner as winter dragged on. It was a ritual as old as the village itself: add water, add scraps, stir, and pray it lasted. Sometimes, you caught a rabbit or trapped a pheasant, a rare and precious thing. When it happened, the whole village shared in the bounty, a pot of thick stew with real meat, the kind that left you full and warm for hours after. Those nights were remembered, spoken of with reverence, a glimmer of light in the long stretch of gray. But mostly, you went hungry. Your body learned to expect less, to survive on thin broth and hard bread, to make do with what there was. Your ribs became familiar under your fingers, and your hands grew rougher, more knotted from the cold. You learned to ignore the ache in your stomach, to work past it, to live alongside it. The steward still came, even in winter, riding high on a horse draped in thick fur. His visits were shorter, his words sharper. There was less to collect, but the ledger had to be balanced, and you knew better than to argue. He never left empty-handed, though sometimes it was just a basket of eggs or a few strips of dried meat. The church took its share too, Father Edwin with his quiet voice and bowed head, thanking you for your tithe even as you handed over the last of your grain. There were whispers sometimes, late at night, of leaving, of running to the cities, of finding work on the docks or in the markets. But no one did. The city was a dream, a half-formed thought that drifted in with the snow and melted with the thaw. You didn't leave because there was nowhere to go. The land held you, its roots wrapped tight around your feet, its weight pressing down on your shoulders. You stayed because it was home. Because you knew the way the snow fell off the roof when the wind blew just right. Because you recognized the sound of each goat's bleat and each crow's caw. Because the fields would wake again, the frost would crack, and the earth would soften under your hands. Winter was survival, nothing more, nothing less. It came and it went, and you endured it. And when the first green shoots pushed up through the thawing mud, you knelt in the dirt and felt something close to joy. Because you had lived through it. Because you were still here. Because spring had returned, and with it, hope. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to release its hold. The snow thinned to a gray slush that clung to the roads and pooled in low spots, turning the village paths into rivers of mud. The air still bit with chill, but there was something softer in the wind, a whisper of change, a promise of green. You watched the world wake up in increments. First came the drip-drip-drip of melting ice from the eaves, then the slow unraveling of frost from the edges of the fields. By midday, puddles shimmered under the weak sunlight, their surfaces flecked with dirt and bits of straw. Birds returned tentatively, their calls hesitant, as if unsure they'd be welcomed back. The animals stirred too. The chickens scratched greedily at the exposed earth, picking through the mud for any sign of life. The goats stamped their hooves impatiently, eager for fresh grass that had not yet dared to sprout. The cows, leaner than you'd like, lumbered out of the sheds with cautious steps, sniffing the air as if testing its sincerity. Work began again in earnest. The fields, long frozen and unforgiving, softened under your hands. You grasped the plow handles, feeling the familiar ache settle into your shoulders as you pushed through the damp earth. The soil resisted at first, clinging stubbornly to the memory of winter, but persistence paid off. Soon, furrows lined the fields like scars, neat and ready for seed. There was ceremony in it. A kind of prayer worked into the rhythm of labor. You tilted your head to the sky, watching the thin clouds drift lazily, and murmured the old words under your breath, half remembered from childhood. May the frost be gone, may the rain be kind, may the sun be steady, and may the Lord see fit to let it grow. Father Edwin blessed the fields as he did every year, walking the perimeter with slow, deliberate steps, his robes skimming the wet ground. He sprinkled holy water from a cracked tin flask, whispering prayers you couldn't hear but knew by heart. The children followed him in a ragged line, giggling when the droplets hit their faces, daring one another to catch the water on their tongues. Sowing began soon after, hands moving in practiced synchrony, scattering seed over the turned soil. Barley, oats, beans, each planted with care, each counted and measured as if it were gold. You watched the seeds disappear into the earth, covered over with a layer of dirt and the weight of hope. The crows gathered on the edges of the fields, black eyes sharp and knowing, waiting for you to leave so they could feast. There were tricks to keeping them at bay. Scarecrows, built from old tunics and stuffed with straw, their arms stretched wide in eternal vigilance. Shiny bits of metal tied to sticks, catching the sunlight and flashing with every gust of wind. The children ran through the rows with sticks, yelling nonsense words and waving their arms wildly, laughing as the birds scattered skyward. Despite your best efforts, the crows always took their share. You cursed them under your breath, but secretly you admired their tenacity. It was survival, plain and simple. They were only doing what you were, finding a way to make it through the season. The steward came, as he always did, with his ledger and his calculating eyes. He watched as you worked, taking notes, counting rows, measuring expectation against reality. He marked down what you owed for seed, what you'd borrowed during the winter, the extra portion of grain promised to the manor in exchange for a pig that hadn't survived the cold. You nodded as he spoke, saying yes even when you wanted to say no. It wasn't worth the trouble. The Lord's men were not cruel, but they were unyielding. Debt was recorded in ink and memory, and neither faded with time. What you owed would be collected come harvest, regardless of the rains or the pests or the thousand things that could go wrong between now and then. You paid because you had to. You endured because there was no choice. Spring festivals came as the days lengthened. The village square filled with noise and laughter, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke. There were dances and songs, faces flushed with joy and ale. For a few brief hours, you let yourself forget the weight of the season to come. You watched the young ones spin in circles, their feet kicking up dust, their voices high and bright against the backdrop of greening fields. You caught glimpses of your own childhood in their smiles, the way the world seemed wider then, the way the sun shone brighter, the way winter always felt farther away. But the fields always called you back. The soil needed turning, the seeds needed tending, and the promise of growth lay thin and fragile in the palms of your hands. So you returned to the work, to the steady rhythm of planting and praying, to the endless motion of hope against doubt. The earth softened under your touch, and the first hints of green poked through the surface, small and stubborn. You knelt to brush the dirt from the tender shoots, marveling at their bravery. They had survived the winter, just as you had. Now came the waiting. Now came the growing. Spring bled into summer with a slow, reluctant grace. The rains became less frequent, the mud firmed underfoot, and the sky stretched wider and bluer than you remembered. The fields were thick with growth now, the barley and oats standing tall and proud, their tips swaying with each breath of wind. You watched them closely, always with the edge of worry that came from too many seasons gone wrong. You knew better than to trust the peace of early summer. It was a trick of the season, a lull before the true work began. Already, whispers of pests drifted through the village. A patch of blight spotted in the south field. Grasshoppers thick as rainclouds in the next village over. You listened but did not speak of it, because words had power, and fear was its own kind of curse. The fields demanded your attention. Weeding, watering, checking for rot or mold. Each stalk of grain was a promise you couldn't afford to break. You walked the rows in the early morning, boots slick with dew, eyes sharp for anything out of place. It was ritualistic, your hands brushing over the leaves, your fingers plucking away anything that threatened to steal from your harvest. Father Edwin wandered the fields with you sometimes, his robes tucked up to avoid the mud, his expression serene despite the work. He murmured blessings under his breath, his hands moving in wide, sweeping gestures that seemed to cut through the air itself. You weren't sure if it did any good, but you didn't mind. The words were soothing, a rhythm that made the labor seem lighter. The sun grew heavier as the days lengthened. By midday, the air hung thick and slow, pressing down on you like a damp blanket. Sweat beaded on your forehead, dampened the back of your neck. The fields were alive with noise, the hum of insects, the distant cry of birds, the whisper of leaves brushing against each other in the wind. The crows came back, of course. They always did. This time, they brought friends, black flocks that settled like shadows along the fence lines, watching with unblinking eyes. You chased them off when you could, waving sticks and shouting nonsense, but they always returned, undeterred and unafraid. Tom, the village elder, swore by the old methods. He hung strips of cloth soaked in vinegar around the borders of the fields, muttered charms tied in bits of twine, set small piles of ash at the corners like wards against evil. "It's not just birds you've got to worry about," he'd say, his voice dropping low. "There are worse things in the fields when the summer's high." You didn't argue with him. No one did. Tom had lived through more harvests than you could count, and his house still stood, his fields still grew. That was reason enough to listen. The real work began in late July, when the heads of grain grew heavy and golden, bending under their own weight. The village buzzed with activity as scythes were sharpened, wagons repaired, ropes checked and rechecked for fraying. Harvest was a kind of war, against time, against weather, against the thousand small tragedies that could undo a season's worth of labor. The men took to the fields at dawn, blades flashing in the early light, cutting clean swathes through the tall stalks. You moved with them, your arms aching from the weight of the scythe, your back screaming by midday. The women followed behind, gathering the fallen grain into tight bundles, binding them with strips of cloth or twine. Children too young to help ran errands, fetched water, chased off the birds that dared to land too close. The work was relentless, unyielding. You barely stopped to eat, taking quick bites of bread or cold stew between passes. The sun climbed high and hung there, unmoving, while you fought the stalks back, cutting and binding, cutting and binding. The piles of grain grew taller, the rows of stubble stretched wider. It was good work, honest work, but you felt every inch of it in your bones. The harvest took days, longer if the weather turned sour. You woke each morning with stiff joints and sore hands, the blisters raw and red across your palms. But you pushed through it, because there was no other choice. The grain had to be brought in before the rains came, before the wind scattered it back across the fields. The last day of harvest was marked with a kind of solemn celebration. You gathered with the others in the village square, sweat-slicked and dust-covered, hands calloused but hearts light. The grain was stacked high, the bundles lined neatly for collection. Tom spoke a few words, short and gruff, something about the mercy of the season and the grace of the land. You weren't sure you believed him, but you nodded along anyway. The steward arrived with his ledger, tallying what was owed. The piles of grain were divided, not equally, never equally, but enough to fill your stores, enough to promise warmth through the winter if you were careful. The Lord's share was carted off with little ceremony, the wagons creaking under the weight of your labor. You watched them go, the relief of the harvest mingling with the familiar sting of loss. You ate well that night. Fresh bread, hot soup, a bit of salted meat if you were lucky. The fire burned bright and the air smelled of roasting herbs. Laughter rang out from the square, children running circles around the fire, their footsteps light and careless. For one night, you allowed yourself the luxury of joy, untempered by worry. But in the quiet moments, when the fire had burned low and the sky had turned black, you found yourself staring at the fields again. The stubble left behind like broken teeth, the crows perched along the fence lines, still watching, always watching. You knew it wasn't over. Harvest was only the beginning. Winter was coming, and it always took its share. The first frost crept in quietly, a thin silver veil stretching across the fields, turning the stubble brittle and sharp underfoot. You woke to it one morning, the breath from your mouth visible in thin, cloudy wisps, the air biting against your skin even before you left the warmth of your bed. The fire had burned low overnight, barely embers, and you shuffled to stir it back to life, watching the flames lick hungrily at the fresh wood. Outside, the village moved slower. Footsteps were heavier, the ground hard and unyielding beneath the frost. The animals huddled together for warmth, their breath steaming in the chill morning light. You saw the first signs of hoarfrost along the edges of the roof, tiny crystals catching the sunlight, turning the thatch silver. It would have been beautiful if it weren't so ominous. The storehouses were full now, packed with the yield from the harvest, each bundle tied and stacked with a kind of reverence. It wasn't enough, there was never enough, but it would do. You watched Tom make his rounds, checking each family's stock, muttering his approval or shaking his head with a grimace. Some would fare better than others. Some always did. By the end of October, the chill had settled in for good. You took to wearing layers, wool cloaks draped over linen shirts, hands wrapped in cloth when you worked outside. The ground was too hard for much planting, and most days were spent mending things that would not last the winter, roofs, fences, the thatched covers for the wells. The mornings were spent chopping firewood, the afternoons dragging it back to the house, piling it against the wall with the vague hope it would last. The manor grew distant. The steward came less often. The Lord, who had made his yearly visit during the harvest, was back in his stone fortress, far away from the creeping cold. You couldn't picture it, his house of stone, the walls thick enough to hold the warmth. Here, you layered cloth and shared body heat with livestock just to make it through the night. The days shortened, the sun dipping below the hills before supper, and you found yourself living more by firelight than sunlight. The nights were long and dark, stretching out like they might never end. You slept in shifts, waking occasionally to check the fire, to stir the embers, to make sure nothing had slipped in during the quiet hours. It wasn't just wolves you worried about, though they were a threat. It was the silence, the way it settled heavy over the village, thick and unmoving. You heard things sometimes in the wind, whispers that threaded through the cracks in the walls, soft voices that you couldn't quite understand. You never spoke of it to anyone, but you knew you weren't the only one. Old stories floated back to life in the long stretches of silence. Tales of things that moved in the dark, of spirits that walked between the trees, of shadows that whispered in the spaces between words. Your mother used to tell you of the spirits that guarded the forest, hungry, restless things that crept closer when the snows came. You didn't believe her, not fully, but on those long nights, you stayed close to the fire just the same. Food was measured with care. The bread was sliced thinner, the stew stretched with more water and fewer vegetables. Salted meat was rationed to mere scraps, a whisper of flavor in an otherwise bland broth. You learned to chew slower, to make it last. Hunger was a familiar companion, but in winter it became sharper, more insistent. The church remained a sanctuary of sorts. Father Edwin kept the doors open, the fire lit, and the altar draped in thick cloth. You went on Sundays, huddled together with the others, your breath fogging the air as you murmured the same prayers, the same pleas for mercy. Edwin spoke of patience, of endurance, of the promise of spring. You nodded along with the others, but you saw the hollowness in their eyes. Not everyone lasted through the winter. That was the truth of it. Illness came creeping through the cracks, slipping in under doorframes, settling in chests and bones. Coughs became more frequent, raspier, deeper. Faces grew paler, thinner. When someone died, it was done quietly, a whispered word from a neighbor, a hurried burial before the ground froze too hard. You didn't talk about it, not openly. There was nothing to be done for it. The dead were gone, and the living had work to do. You cut more wood. You patched more roofs. You boiled the same stew with the same thin bones and prayed it would last. But there were moments of light, even in the depths of the cold. Nights when the sky would clear and the stars would burn bright and sharp, spread out like scattered coins across a midnight cloth. You would stand outside for a moment, just long enough to watch your breath curl upwards and fade into the dark. And once, just once, the aurora came. Green and purple light rippling across the sky, silent and surreal. You watched it with the others, standing ankle-deep in snow, faces turned upwards, mouths open in disbelief. For those few moments, the world was bigger than your village, bigger than your life. It was magic, and it was enough to remind you why you endured. But the light faded, the sky returned to black, and the wind came back stronger than before. You returned to your house, closed the door tight, and banked the fire with shaking hands. Outside, the frost thickened, the trees groaned under its weight, and winter settled in for the long stretch. The world had shrunk to the size of your firelight, and all you could do was wait for it to grow again. The winter stretched on with a kind of relentless patience, the frost thickening in layers, the snow growing deeper with each passing day. Each morning, you would step outside, breath clouding the air, and check the roof for leaks, the woodpile for gaps, the fence line for breaks. It became ritual, small, careful movements repeated endlessly to keep the cold at bay. You noticed it first when you were out chopping wood. A flicker of movement near the tree line, too far to make out clearly, but distinct enough to catch your eye. You paused, axe held loosely in your hands, squinting into the pale light of midday. The forest stood still, its branches heavy with snow, its shadow stretching long across the frozen ground. You waited, breath held, eyes fixed on the place where you'd seen it. Nothing moved. No sound, no stirring of branches, just the wind sighing through the trees. You let out the breath you'd been holding, shook your head, and went back to work. But the feeling lingered, an itch at the back of your mind. You were being watched. The others didn't believe you, of course. When you mentioned it over supper, Tom just grunted, chewing his bread slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Wolves," he said finally, with the confidence of someone who had seen too many winters to be frightened by shadows. "They come closer in winter. Hungry." But it hadn't felt like wolves. You knew their movements, the way they prowled at the edge of the village, eyes glowing in the firelight, careful and deliberate. This had been different. Human, maybe. Or something close enough to make you shiver. The next day, you went back out, this time with a knife strapped to your belt and a sharper sense of caution. The woods were quiet, as they always were in winter. The snow muffled sound, turning everything soft and distant. But you felt it again, the sense of being watched. You stopped chopping, set the axe down, and turned slowly, scanning the line of trees. Your breath came out in thick clouds, hanging in the air before dissipating. For a long moment, there was nothing. And then, just at the edge of your vision, you saw it. A figure, half shrouded by the shadow of a fir tree, watching you. Tall, thin, cloaked in something dark and heavy. Too far to see a face, but close enough that you felt the weight of its gaze. You blinked, and it was gone, slipping back into the forest with a kind of fluid grace that made your stomach twist. You told Tom again, and this time he didn't laugh. He just stared at you, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed. "There's nothing in those woods but wolves and bad luck," he said finally, his voice low and firm. "Keep your eyes on your work. Don't go looking for trouble." You nodded, but the unease settled deep, a shadow that lingered long after the fire burned low. You slept lightly that night, waking at every creak, every shift of the wind against the shutters. Outside, the snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the world in silence. Days passed. You didn't see the figure again, but the feeling remained. A sense of wrongness, like the woods were holding their breath. You went about your work cautiously, glancing over your shoulder more often, the knife never far from your hand. It was a week later when the shepherd's boy disappeared. No one saw him go, not at first. He'd been out with the sheep, a ragged bundle of wool and bone, trudging through the snow with his dog. When he didn't come back, people assumed he'd lingered too long, maybe stayed with a neighbor to wait out the worst of the storm. But he didn't come back the next day. Or the next. His father went out looking, dragging along two of the village men, their breath huffing out in clouds, their eyes dark with worry. They found the dog first, dead and frozen at the edge of the wood, its body stiff and twisted. The boy was never found. Tom gathered the village that night, the fire crackling low, shadows flickering across worn faces. He spoke plainly, his voice heavy with the weight of winter and something darker. "There's something in the woods," he said. "Something that wasn't there before." No one spoke. The fire crackled, the wind sighed against the shutters, and the silence stretched out between you all like a taut string. Finally, one of the older women spoke, her voice thin and brittle. "The stories," she murmured, eyes fixed on the flames. "The ones my mother used to tell, about the shadow walkers." Tom shook his head, but his eyes were dark, his hands tight around the hilt of his knife. "Stories," he said firmly. "Nothing more." But you saw the way his eyes flickered towards the window, the way his hand tightened on the blade. He didn't believe his own words. That night, you slept with the knife under your pillow and a fire burning low, the light flickering across the walls, stretching shadows long and thin. Outside, the wind howled, and you could almost imagine you heard footsteps crunching softly in the snow, just outside your door. The next day, no one went into the woods. The village fell into an uneasy rhythm after the boy's disappearance. People kept to their homes after dusk, doors were barred, and fires were stoked higher than usual. The old stories crept back into whispered conversation, tales of shadow walkers, spirits that moved silently through snow, leaving no footprints behind. Some scoffed, shaking their heads over mugs of watered-down ale, but even the most skeptical kept their voices low, as if afraid something might hear. The forest seemed to grow darker in those days. You noticed it when you went out for firewood, the shadows stretching deeper, the trees whispering with each gust of wind. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Sometimes, you would turn quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever lingered at the edge of the wood. But there was never anything there. Tom tried to keep the village calm, barking orders to reinforce fences, checking every shutter himself to make sure it latched properly. But you could see it in his eyes, he didn't believe his own reassurances. He was scared, more than you had ever seen him. And if Tom was scared, it meant something was truly wrong. One evening, as the last light of day bled into the horizon, you heard it, the whispers. Faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of chopping wood. But they grew louder, rising and falling with the wind, like voices carried from far away. You paused, axe halfway through a log, breath steaming in the cold air. The whispers were soft, almost gentle, threading through the branches like silk. You couldn't understand the words, but they stirred something in you, a memory, a fear you couldn't name. You dropped the axe, stepping forward slowly, the snow crunching under your feet. The sound grew louder, pulling you closer to the tree line. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. You strained to hear, leaning forward as if the words would become clear if you just got a little bit closer. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped. Silence settled over the woods, deep and heavy. You stood there, heart pounding, breath coming in sharp bursts that fogged the air. The trees loomed above you, tall and still, as if watching, waiting. You took a step back, then another, the snow shifting under your feet. A branch snapped somewhere deeper in the forest, sharp and sudden. You turned and ran, the cold air biting at your lungs, feet slipping on patches of ice. You didn't stop until you were back inside, the door barred, the fire stoked high. That night, you couldn't sleep. The whispers stayed with you, curling around your thoughts like tendrils of fog. You lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. It sounded different now, more like voices, more like laughter. The next morning, you went to Tom. His door was already open, smoke curling from the chimney, the smell of burning wood thick in the air. He looked up as you stepped inside, eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "You hear them too?" you asked, voice low. Tom didn't answer right away. He poured 2 cups of ale, setting one in front of you. His hands shook as he drank. He said finally, his voice rough. "I hear them." The silence hung heavy between you. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. You both flinched. "Could be wolves," you said, though you didn't believe it. Tom shook his head, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Wolves don't whisper," he replied. "And they don't laugh." Neither of you spoke after that. You sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind. The whispers came again that night, louder this time. You could hear them even through the walls, threading through the cracks, slipping under the door. You sat by the fire, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the snow fell thick and heavy, covering the ground in a shroud of white. No one slept that night. In the morning, you saw the tracks, light, delicate footprints, circling the edge of the village, tracing the fence line. Too small for a man, too deliberate for an animal. They led from the forest and back again, winding through the snow in loops and spirals, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them was playing a game. You followed them to the edge of the wood, where they vanished into the shadows. You stood there for a long time, breath clouding in the air, eyes straining to see beyond the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing whispered. But you could feel it watching. The tracks became a part of life in the village. Each morning, you would wake up, rub the sleep from your eyes, and check the snow. Sometimes they were there, delicate imprints that danced in loops and spirals, trailing from the edge of the woods and back again. Sometimes, they weren't. But the whispers always came. Tom organized watch groups, pairs of men and women patrolling the perimeter of the village, torches burning low, breath pluming in the frigid air. You joined them, taking shifts with a few others. It was mostly silent work, boots crunching through snow, eyes scanning the darkness for movement. There was nothing to find, just the whispers, distant and taunting, threading through the trees. One night, as you stood at the edge of the forest with a torch in hand, you saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. You froze, the torchlight wavering as your hand trembled. For a moment, you thought it was just your mind playing tricks. But then it moved again, quick, deliberate. A flash of pale skin, the whisper of fabric. "Tom," you hissed, voice low and sharp. He hurried over, his own torch lighting up his weary face. "What is it?" You pointed, hand shaking. "There. In the trees." Tom squinted into the darkness, eyes narrowing. For a long moment, there was only silence, the wind sighing through the branches. And then you both saw it, a figure, pale and thin, stepping from the shadows. It didn't run. It didn't hide. It just stood there, watching. What is that?" Tom whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. You didn't answer. You couldn't. The figure was too far to make out details, but there was something wrong. The way it moved, the way it stood, too still, too silent. You raised your torch higher, the flames flickering. The light didn't seem to reach it. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, blurring the edges of its form. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the trees without a sound. Tom swore under his breath. "We need to tell the others." You nodded, feet already moving, the snow crunching loudly in your ears. The whispers grew louder as you left, curling around you like smoke, trailing behind you into the village. The meeting was called the next morning. People crowded into Tom's hut, the walls creaking under the weight of so many bodies. Faces were pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. You spoke first, recounting what you'd seen, the whispers, the footprints, the figure in the trees. When you were finished, the room fell silent. An old woman spoke up from the back, her voice shaking. "It's the forest," she said. "It's waking up." There were murmurs, nods, a few crossed themselves quietly. You didn't understand. "Waking up?" you asked, turning to her. Her eyes met yours, hollow and tired. "It happens sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. The forest, it remembers." "Remembers what?" Tom demanded, leaning forward, his knuckles white on the edge of the table. The old woman shook her head slowly. "Those who never left." The room went silent again. You felt a chill creep down your spine. "What does that mean?" But the old woman just turned her gaze back to the fire, lips pressed tight. She wouldn't speak again, not even when Tom pressed her. She just sat there, rocking slightly, her eyes locked on the flames. The whispers came back that night, louder than ever. You couldn't sleep. You lay by the fire, knife by your side, listening as the wind howled and the whispers threaded through the cracks in the walls. They sounded closer now, almost as if they were coming from inside. In the morning, the tracks were back, winding through the snow in perfect, delicate lines. This time, they led to the old church at the edge of the village. The building had been abandoned for years, its stone walls crumbling, the roof sagging under the weight of too many winters. No one went there anymore. But the tracks led right to its door, circling it once, twice, 3 times before disappearing into the shadows. You and Tom stood there, staring at the tracks, your breath fogging in the cold air. "We need to go in," you said, voice barely above a whisper. Tom turned to you, his eyes wide and rimmed with exhaustion. "Are you mad? That place is cursed." You shook your head, staring at the tracks, the way they vanished into the darkness. "I don't think we have a choice." He was silent for a long time, eyes scanning the trees, the snow, the heavy sky above. Finally, he nodded, the movement stiff and reluctant. "At first light," he said. You both walked back to the village, the whispers trailing behind you like shadows, like ghosts. The dawn came slowly, creeping over the frostbitten hills and casting long shadows across the village. You and Tom were waiting, boots laced, torches in hand. A few others had joined, old Maud, whose eyes were sharper than anyone's in the village, and Joran, the blacksmith's son, tall and broad-shouldered, his hands like iron. No one spoke as you walked. The path was familiar, though it hadn't been traveled in years. Snow crunched underfoot, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of voices. It was colder here. You could feel it in your bones, like the air itself was thicker, pressing down against your lungs. The old church rose from the snow like a crumbling monument, its walls leaning with age, the stones cracked and buckling. Vines had crept over its surface, clinging desperately to the frozen mortar. Its windows were shattered, glass shards scattered like ice across the ground. The tracks led right to the door. Perfect, delicate impressions that circled 3 times before slipping under the splintered wooden frame. You stared at them, heart pounding in your chest. They hadn't been made by shoes. That much was clear. But the shape, it was wrong. Too long, too thin. Almost as if Tom's hand fell on your shoulder, snapping you from your thoughts. We go in, look around, then we leave. No games. No wandering off. Understand? You nodded, but your eyes were still on the tracks. Right. Joran pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest. Dust billowed out in thick clouds, the smell of rot and something older flooding your senses. The interior was dark, the light barely filtering through the cracked windows. Pews lay scattered, toppled over, their wood splintered and broken. The altar stood at the far end, draped in shadows, its stone surface cracked and uneven. Tom stepped forward first, torch held high. The flame flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. You followed, eyes scanning the room. It felt wrong, like the air was heavier, pressing against your skin, clawing at your throat. There, Maud whispered, her voice sharp and thin. She pointed to the far corner, where the tracks reappeared, winding delicately through the dust, circling a crumbling stone pillar, and disappearing behind the altar. The whispers grew louder. Not real whispers, but echoes, soft, distant, like the memory of sound. You strained to hear them, leaning forward. They weren't speaking words. Not any you could understand. It was more like humming. A low, melodic hum that resonated through the stone walls, vibrating beneath your feet. Tom moved cautiously, stepping over the debris, his boots crunching against broken glass. "There's something back here," he called, his voice muffled. You followed, your torchlight bobbing against the cracked stone. Behind the altar, the tracks stopped. They didn't lead anywhere. They just ended. Tom was crouched down, running his hand along the floor, brushing away years of dust. It's stone," he muttered, confused. "There's no door. No tunnel. Just stone." You stepped closer, the whispers, no, the hum, growing louder. It was coming from below. You knelt, brushing your hand along the surface. It was smooth, almost polished, different from the rough stone that made up the rest of the church. Maud crossed herself, her eyes wide. "It's a grave," she whispered. Tom looked up sharply. "What?" "A grave," she repeated, pointing at the stone. "Look at the markings." You leaned in, torchlight flickering against the surface. There were marks, shallow, worn down by time and weather. Symbols you didn't recognize. Lines and curves that looped back on themselves, spiraling inward. They felt old. Older than the church, older than the village. Joran stepped back, his face pale. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. This isn't right." Tom ignored him, running his fingers along the symbols. "It's warm," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "Feel it." You reached out, pressing your hand against the stone. He was right. It was warm. Not the kind of warmth that came from sunlight or fire. It was deeper, pulsing just below the surface. Alive. We need to go, Maud whispered, her voice trembling. Now. Tom shook his head. Not yet. He pulled out his knife, the blade glinting in the torchlight. Help me pry this up. Joran stepped forward, hesitating. I don't think. Just do it, Tom snapped, his voice sharper than you'd ever heard it. You watched as they wedged the blade beneath the stone, straining against its weight. The whispers, no, the hum, grew louder, vibrating through the floor, up your legs, into your chest. You could feel it pulsing, alive and rhythmic. With a groan, the stone shifted. Dust billowed up, and the hum became a roar. You staggered back, hand covering your mouth as the air thickened with grit and whispers. The stone slid to the side, revealing darkness below. You peered over the edge, torchlight flickering. There were steps. Worn, spiraling downward, swallowed by shadows. The hum pulsed from below, deep and slow, like a heartbeat. Tom stared down, his eyes wide with wonder. Well, he whispered, voice shaking. Looks like we found our answer. The whispers swirled around you, curling through your hair, brushing against your skin. It felt like a breath, like a sigh. You shivered. Joran stepped back, his face pale. I'm not going down there, he muttered. Tom turned to you, eyes gleaming with something you couldn't quite place. Are you? You swallowed hard, torchlight flickering against the walls, casting long shadows that bent and stretched. The whispers rose, soft and melodic, threading through your thoughts, pulling you forward. You looked at Tom, then back at the stairs. Yes, you said, your voice barely above a whisper. I'm going. The air grew colder as you stepped onto the first stone step. Tom followed, his torchlight flickering in the shadows. Behind you, Joran hesitated, his eyes wide and fearful. I'm not going down there, he repeated, voice shaking. Tom turned, his face shadowed by the torchlight. Then stay up here and freeze, he snapped. Or better yet, keep watch. Joran glanced back at the broken church door, then at you. His expression wavered, a flicker of something like shame crossing his features. With a heavy sigh, he stepped back from the edge. I'll keep watch. Tom smirked. Good lad. You turned back to the stairs, heart pounding. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct. They weren't words, at least not any you recognized, but they rose and fell in a rhythm that tugged at your thoughts. It was like a song sung in a language just out of reach. The steps spiraled down, slick with damp and age, curling deeper into the earth. The air was thick, musty, with the scent of wet stone and something else, something metallic. The torchlight flickered, shadows dancing along the walls. The symbols you'd seen above reappeared here, carved into the stone in long, sweeping arcs. They glittered faintly as if touched by moonlight, though there was none to be found. What do you think this place is? You whispered, the words barely carrying over the whispers. Tom glanced back at you, his eyes narrowed. Don't know. But it's old. Older than the church, I reckon. His fingers traced one of the symbols, the torchlight casting long shadows. Feels like it's been waiting. Waiting for what? He shrugged. Maybe us. The words settled heavily between you, like a weight neither of you could shake off. You descended further, the air growing thicker, pressing against your lungs. Your breath came out in shallow puffs, visible even in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, curling around you, brushing against your ears like fingers. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs leveled off, opening into a vast chamber. The torchlight flickered across the stone walls, revealing arches that rose into the shadows, stretching up beyond sight. The whispers grew softer here, more distant, like echoes bouncing off ancient walls. In the center of the room stood an altar. Unlike the one above, this was pristine, untouched by time. Its surface gleamed with the same symbols carved deep into its surface. Around it lay offerings, rusted coins, shards of pottery, broken weapons, and wilted flowers, long dead but still clinging to their shapes. Tom stepped forward, his torchlight flickering over the altar. This isn't right," he murmured, voice shaking. His hand reached out, hovering just above the surface. "It's warm." You stepped closer, heart pounding. The symbols glimmered faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the whispers. They curled and looped, spiraling outwards from the center. "It's like the stone above," you whispered. Tom nodded, his eyes wide. "Older than the church," he repeated. His fingers brushed the surface, and the symbols flared, a bright flash of light that sent you stumbling back. The whispers roared, filling the chamber, bouncing off the walls, swirling around you. The torchlight flickered wildly, shadows stretching and twisting. Tom staggered back, clutching his hand. What the hell was that?" You didn't answer. You couldn't. Your eyes were fixed on the altar. The symbols were glowing, bright and furious, casting light across the chamber. The offerings shook, rattling against the stone. Coins bounced, pottery shards clattered, and the whispers grew louder, threading through your thoughts, curling around your senses. Tom was shaking his head, backing away. "We need to leave," he whispered, voice barely audible over the noise. "We need to get out of here." You didn't move. You couldn't. Your feet were rooted to the spot, eyes locked on the altar. The light pulsed, rhythmic and slow, pulling you forward. You took a step, then another, your hand reaching out. Tom grabbed your arm, yanking you back. "No," he hissed, his voice desperate. "Don't touch it. Whatever this is, it's not meant for us." The whispers faltered, slipping back into echoes, soft and distant. The light faded, symbols dimming back to shadows. The air grew still. You blinked, shaking your head. The room was silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the torch. Tom was breathing heavily, his grip still tight on your arm. His eyes were wild, darting back and forth. "We're leaving," he said, voice trembling. You nodded, your legs unsteady. Yeah, I think you're right." Tom didn't wait for you to catch your breath. He grabbed the torch, turning back toward the stairs. You cast one last glance at the altar, the symbols still faintly glowing, whispering their song into the darkness. You didn't look back again. The stone steps groaned beneath your weight as you and Tom hurried back up. The whispers still echoed faintly, like distant memories clinging to the edges of your thoughts. Behind you, the shadows stretched longer, flickering with the dying light of the torch. When you finally reached the top, Joran was pacing by the broken door, his eyes wide with impatience. "Took you long enough," he muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The wind howled through the cracks of the church, rattling the wooden beams and sending a cascade of dust from the ceiling. Tom threw him a dark look. "Shut it, Joran. You didn't see what we saw." Joran folded his arms, his gaze flickering from Tom to you. "Yeah? And what did you see?" "You opened your mouth, but no words came." "How could you describe it?" "The altar, the whispers, the symbols that pulsed with light older than stone. It felt ridiculous to even try." You shook your head, wiping the sweat from your brow. "We need to leave." Tom nodded, his expression grim. This place is wrong. That altar, it's not just stone. It's waiting for something." Joran scoffed, shaking his head. "You've both gone mad. It's just some old ruin. All churches look like this when you leave them to rot." Tom stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I know what I saw, Joran. And I know you've heard the whispers. Don't pretend you haven't." Joran stiffened, glancing back at the door. "I don't hear anything," he said, too quickly. Tom snorted. "Liar." The three of you stood in tense silence, the wind howling through the broken walls, carrying whispers that curled around your ears like tendrils of fog. You shivered, pulling your cloak tighter. "We should get back to the village," you said finally. "Warn the others." Joran laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Warn them of what?" "Some stones with funny markings? An old altar?" "Something is down there," Tom interrupted, his voice shaking. "Something old, something that's been waiting." Joran raised an eyebrow. "And you think it's gonna come up here and get us, do you? Should we leave out milk and bread for it too?" Tom stepped forward, grabbing Joran by the collar. "I'm serious. You think I'm making this up? You go down there, and you'll see." Joran wrenched himself free, dusting off his coat. "You're both idiots. There's nothing here but dust and echoes. And I'm not sticking around to listen to you scare yourselves to death." Without another word, he turned and marched out of the church, his footsteps echoing across the stone floor. Tom watched him go, fists clenched. "He's a fool." You placed a hand on his shoulder. "We need to think about what to do next. If this place is dangerous, we can't just leave it." Tom turned to you, his eyes wild. "We can't do anything about it. Not alone." "Then we tell the village," you insisted. "Maybe someone knows more about this place. Maybe the elder." Tom scoffed. "The elder? He's barely got the sense to count his own sheep. You think he knows anything about an altar hidden under the church?" You hesitated. "Maybe not, but someone has to. Maybe the priest." Tom looked at you for a long moment, his eyes searching your face. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. The priest. If he's still there." The wind picked up outside, howling through the cracks in the stone, whispering through the trees. The sound sent a chill down your spine. "Let's get out of here," you muttered, turning toward the broken doors. Tom followed, his torch still flickering, casting long shadows along the walls. As you stepped out into the cold, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds. The village lay just beyond the hill, the rooftops shrouded in mist. The walk back was silent, the only sound the crunch of frost underfoot and the distant wail of the wind. Tom didn't speak, his face locked in a grim expression. You kept your eyes ahead, heart still hammering from what you'd seen below. As you approached the village, the familiar sights brought a wave of relief, a curl of smoke from a chimney, the distant bark of a dog, the faint call of someone tending their goats. It felt almost normal. But you knew it wasn't. Not anymore. You and Tom exchanged a glance. "We find the priest," he said firmly. You nodded. "And we tell him everything." But as you stepped into the village square, you realized something was wrong. The streets were empty. No merchants haggling over grain. No children chasing each other through the mud. Just silence. Tom stiffened beside you. "Where is everyone?" You swallowed hard, the chill in the air growing sharper. "I don't know." The whispers returned, faint and distant, curling around your thoughts like tendrils of fog. You turned back toward the hill, where the old church stood, its roof sagging against the sky. Tom followed your gaze. His face was pale, eyes wide. "You hear it too, don't you?" You nodded slowly, the whispers growing louder, pressing against your thoughts. "We need to find the priest, now." The silence that settled over the village after the final blow was not one of peace, but of waiting. A collective breath held tight, stretched over moments that felt like years. Fires crackled in hearths long left cold. Doors creaked open, hesitant and trembling, as villagers stepped outside, squinting against the pale light of dawn. The mist hung heavy, clinging to the earth as if it too was unsure of what came next. Daphne emerged from her father's house, her eyes rimmed with red, but her shoulders squared. She carried with her the knife, still smeared with the dirt of the forest floor. She didn't wipe it clean, she didn't need to. Let it serve as a reminder of the choices they had made, the sacrifices that bound them. Behind her, the elders gathered, their faces pale but resolute. The quiet strength of survival had returned to their eyes. The fields lay untouched, stretching out towards the horizon like a promise. It was Tom who broke the silence first, his voice hoarse but steady. "The land is ours now," he said, not as a declaration but as a simple truth. His hand was clenched around the walking stick he'd used for years, the wood polished from the grip of hard days. "We till it, we guard it. And we answer to no one but ourselves." A murmur ran through the crowd, hesitant at first, then swelling with belief. They had seen too much, endured too much to doubt now. The manor stood empty on the hill, its windows dark and yawning like the hollow eyes of a skull. No one moved towards it. It was a relic of another time, one that held no power over them anymore. Daphne looked to the east, where the sun was just beginning to crest the hills, casting long shadows over the rooftops. Her fingers curled tighter around the blade in her hand, and she nodded once, firmly. "We build from here," she said simply, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We plant. We harvest. And we remember." And they did. Spring came cautiously, as if testing the strength of their resolve. The earth thawed beneath their feet, and seeds were sown with hands that had been made strong through years of labor. The soil turned rich and dark, the scent of growth hanging heavy in the air. Carts were mended, roofs patched, and fires burned in every hearth. News of the village spread slowly, whispered among travelers and merchants who passed through the countryside. A village with no lord. A place where the people governed themselves, where the harvest was shared, and the work divided not by fear, but by necessity. Some laughed at the thought, shaking their heads at the foolishness of it. Others listened quietly and wondered. Seasons bled into each other, marked not by taxes or demands, but by the rhythm of planting and harvest. The village elder became not a figure of power, but of trust, and decisions were made with hands calloused by labor, not soft with privilege. The children grew strong, their eyes sharp and unclouded by fear. They played in fields that belonged to them, ran through forests where no banner flew above the treetops. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the village gathered around the fire, Daphne sat with her hands folded in her lap, the knife long since cleaned and sheathed at her side. Tom leaned towards her, his voice low. "You did it," he said, his eyes gleaming with pride and something deeper. "We did it," she corrected him gently, her gaze sweeping over the faces illuminated by firelight. "All of us." They sat in silence, watching the flames flicker and dance, casting long shadows against the walls of the homes they had built with their own hands. The wind whispered through the trees, not with the chill of fear, but with the warmth of promise. The village had a name now. It was their own. And as the stars blinked awake in the sky, Daphne closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. For the first time in her life, she slept without fear. The night was quiet, not with the silence of dread, but with the peace of freedom hard won. The village thrived, and its story spread, an echo of rebellion, of unity, of survival. Long after the fires had burned down to embers, long after the names were whispered only in bedtime tales, the land remained. Tended by those who understood its worth, who had bled for its freedom, and who had carved their own destiny from the soil with nothing but grit and unyielding will. And the world, vast and unchanging, rolled on. But the village? It endured.